You drove home yesterday? Do you remember turning left at Maple Street? Do you remember checking your mirrors at the intersection? Do you remember the color of the car that passed you 3 blocks before your driveway? Of course you don't, you were there. Your eyes were open, your hands were on the wheel. But you, the conscious you were somewhere else entirely. Your brain had switched to autopilot, and you never even noticed the transition. This isn't a failure of memory. This is something far more unsettling. This is evidence that consciousness, your consciousness, is not the unified, continuous stream you believe it to be. It's a fragmented, glitchy system that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and most of the time, you're not even aware which level is running the show. Welcome to the first glitch in your personal matrix. The autopilot phenomenon reveals that your brain has been making decisions without consulting the part of you that thinks it's in charge. Every day, for hours at a time, you surrender control to neural pathways that run on pure automation. And the most disturbing part, you trust this system completely. Think about your morning routine. You brush your teeth, but do you consciously decide which tooth to start with? You put on your shoes, but do you actively think about which foot goes first? You walk to the kitchen, but are you consciously coordinating the thousands of muscle contractions required for each step? No. You're running on biological software that operates below the threshold of awareness. Your conscious mind is like a CEO who thinks he's running the company, but the real work is being done by employees he never sees, making decisions he never approves, following protocols he never established. The autopilot state reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness. It's not a single entity. It's a coalition of processes, and the process you identify as you is often not the one in control. When you're driving, walking, or performing any familiar task, different neural networks take over. They use your body, your senses, your motor functions, but they don't need your conscious participation. This is why you can have entire conversations you don't remember, make decisions that surprise you later, or find yourself in places with no recollection of how you got there. You weren't unconscious. You were operating under a different mode of consciousness, one that doesn't create the kind of memories your reflective self can access. But here's what makes this phenomenon truly disturbing. Autopilot doesn't just control simple motor functions. It influences your thoughts, your emotions, your reactions to other people. How many times have you said something and immediately wondered where it came from? How many times have you felt an emotion that seemed to arise from nowhere? How many times have you made a decision that, upon reflection, doesn't align with your conscious values or intentions? These aren't random occurrences, they're glimpses into the vast, unconscious machinery that operates your mind. Autopilot is always running in the background, making micro-decisions, forming impressions, preparing responses. It's like having a roommate in your head who you never see but who rearranges your mental furniture when you're not looking. The neuroscience behind autopilot reveals that your brain is constantly predicting what will happen next. It creates models of reality based on past experience and runs simulations to prepare for future scenarios. When you're in familiar territory, these predictive models become so accurate that consciousness becomes optional. Your brain can navigate reality without bothering to wake up the executive functions. This is efficient, but it's also dangerous. Autopilot operates on pattern recognition, not creative problem solving. It assumes the future will resemble the past. It can't adapt to novel situations or recognize when circumstances have changed in subtle but important ways. When autopilot is running your life, you become a prisoner of your own habit, responding to the world as it was, not as it is. Think about your relationships. How often do you interact with people based on old patterns rather than present realities? How often do you assume you know what someone is going to say before they say it? How often do you react to your interpretation of their intentions rather than their actual words or actions? Autopilot turns every interaction into a reenactment of previous interactions. It sees patterns that may no longer exist and responds to ghosts of past conversations. This is why relationships can feel stuck, why people seem to repeat the same conflicts over and over, why genuine communication becomes so difficult. We're not really talking to each other, we're talking to our predictions of each other. The most unsettling aspect of autopilot is how seamlessly it integrates with conscious experience. You don't feel like you're switching between modes. There's no sensation of handing over control to unconscious processes. The transition is invisible, which means you have no way of knowing when it's happening. You could be on autopilot right now, reading these words without really processing them, nodding along with familiar ideas while your attention is actually focused on something else entirely. This raises a profound question. If autopilot can control your behavior, your reactions, and even your thoughts without your awareness, then what exactly is the role of consciousness? Are you the driver of your experience, or are you just along for the ride, occasionally grabbing the wheel when something unexpected happens? The answer is both more complex and more disturbing than you might expect. Consciousness appears to be less of a controller and more of a narrator. It doesn't make decisions so much as it creates stories about decisions that have already been made by unconscious processes. Your sense of being in control, of choosing your actions and thoughts, may itself be a kind of autopilot function designed to maintain the illusion of unified selfhood. But if this is true, then every moment of your life is a collaboration between processes you're aware of and processes you're not. The person you think you are is constantly being influenced, guided, and sometimes overridden by systems that operate in the shadows of your mind. You're not one consciousness, you're multiple consciousnesses taking turns, and most of the time you don't even notice when the shift occurs. This is the first glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that you're often not the one in control of your own experience. Autopilot isn't a bug, it's a feature, but it's a feature that operates so smoothly, so invisibly, that you've forgotten it exists, and in forgetting, you've lost track of who's really driving your life. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you'd lived that exact moment before? Not similar to a previous experience, but identical. The same lighting, the same arrangement of objects, the same feeling in your chest, the same words about to be spoken. For a few seconds, reality splits in two. The present moment and its perfect duplicate from a time that never existed. Then it passes. The feeling dissolves, leaving you with nothing but the memory of having remembered something that couldn't possibly be a memory. This is déjà vu, and it's not just a curiosity of consciousness. It's a window into the temporal architecture of your mind, revealing that your experience of time is far more fragmented and unreliable than you've ever suspected. Déjà vu exposed the fact that your brain doesn't experience the present moment directly. Instead, it constructs your sense of now from multiple streams of information that are processed at slightly different speeds. Visual data, auditory input, emotional responses, memory associations, they all arrive at consciousness through different neural pathways with different processing delays. Most of the time, your brain synchronizes these streams seamlessly, creating the illusion of a unified present moment. But sometimes, the synchronization glitches. When déjà vu occurs, some piece of current experience gets accidentally routed through your memory formation circuits before reaching consciousness. The result is that you experience the present moment as if it were a memory, creating the uncanny sensation that you've lived this exact scenario before. It's not that you're remembering the future, it's that you're remembering the present as it happens. This reveals something profound about the nature of memory itself. Memory isn't a storage system where experiences are filed away after they occur. Memory is an active, ongoing process that operates in real time, constantly shaping how you perceive and interpret current events. Your memories don't just preserve the past, they filter the present, determining what you notice how you feel, and what you think is going to happen next. During déjà vu, this filtration system malfunctions in a way that makes the malfunction visible. You catch your brain in the act of constructing your sense of time, and the construction process is revealed to be far more artificial than you realized. The smooth flow of time from past to present to future isn't a natural phenomenon you experience. It's a narrative your brain creates by stitching together discrete moments of awareness. Think about what this means for your sense of identity. If your experience of time is constructed rather than direct, then your sense of being a continuous self moving through time is also a construction. You're not the same person experiencing a sequence of moments, you're a sequence of momentary selves, each one created by the brain's attempt to maintain continuity between disconnected instances of awareness. Déjà vu shows you the seams in this construction. For a few seconds, the timeline glitches and you experience the impossible sensation of temporal overlap. You become aware that your sense of linear progression through time is a story your brain tells you, not an accurate description of how consciousness actually works. But déjà vu is just the most obvious example of temporal glitching in consciousness. There are other, subtler ways that your experience of time reveals its artificial nature. Have you ever noticed how time seems to slow down during emergencies? How a car accident can feel like it's happening in slow motion, with every detail crystal clear and every second stretched into an eternity. This isn't just a subjective impression. During high-stress situations, your brain actually changes how it processes time. It increases the frame rate of consciousness, capturing more detailed information per unit of time. The result is that when you later remember the event, it seems to have lasted longer than it actually did. Your brain creates more memory data for those moments, so when you replay them, they take longer to replay. This reveals that your normal experience of time is actually quite low resolution. Most of your life is processed at a reduced frame rate with large gaps between moments of actual awareness. You experience consciousness as a continuous stream, but it's actually more like a slideshow running fast enough to create the illusion of motion. The spaces between the slides, the gaps in awareness, are filled in by your brain's prediction and interpolation systems. Just as your visual system fills in the blind spot in your retina, your temporal processing system fills in the gaps in your stream of consciousness. You don't notice the gaps because your brain seamlessly bridges them with generated content. But sometimes the bridge-building system malfunctions, and you become aware of the discontinuities in your experience. You might find yourself in a conversation with no memory of how it started, or discover that hours have passed while you were absorbed in a task, or realize that you've been thinking about something without any recollection of when the thought began. These aren't signs of distraction or absent-mindedness, they're glimpses of the fundamental discontinuity of consciousness. Your awareness doesn't flow smoothly from moment to moment, it jumps between islands of attention with vast oceans of unconscious processing in between. This discontinuity explains why memory is so unreliable. You're not remembering a continuous experience, you're remembering selected highlights from a fragmented stream of consciousness. The brain chooses which moments to preserve and which to discard, then creates narrative connections between the preserved moments to maintain the illusion of continuity. When you remember yesterday, you're not accessing a recording of your experience. You're reconstructing a story from scattered data points, filling in the gaps with assumptions, expectations, and details borrowed from other memories. The result feels like a coherent recollection, but it's actually a creative reconstruction that may bear little resemblance to what actually happened. Déjà vu reveals this creative process by creating a false memory in real time. You experience the sensation of remembering something that just happened, which is impossible if memory works the way you think it does, but it's perfectly explicable if memory is a real-time construction process that occasionally misfires. The implications are staggering. If your experience of time is constructed, if your memories are reconstructions, if your sense of continuity is an illusion, then what exactly is your relationship to your own past? Are you the same person who had experiences yesterday? Or are you a new person created fresh each moment, inheriting a collection of stories about someone who might have existed before? Déjà vu suggests the latter. It shows you that the boundary between memory and imagination is far more porous than you assumed. Your sense of having lived through previous experiences may be just as artificial as the sensation that you've lived through the current moment before. This is the second glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that your experience of time is a construction, not a perception. You don't move through time. Time moves through you as your brain creates and destroys versions of yourself in rapid succession. You remember your first day of school, the nervous excitement, the smell of new crayons, the way your mother's hand felt as she walked you to the classroom door. The memory is vivid, detailed, emotionally rich. It feels absolutely real because it is real. It's a real memory of something that never actually happened. Not the first day of school itself. That happened. But the memory you have of it, that's a reconstruction, a creative blend of actual experience, subsequent thoughts about the experience, stories you've heard from others, expectations about what first days of school should feel like, and details borrowed from movies, books, and other people's stories. Your brain has taken fragments of real experience and woven them into a coherent narrative that feels like direct recollection, but is actually sophisticated fiction. This isn't a flaw in your memory system. This is how memory is designed to work. Your brain doesn't store experiences like a video camera stores footage. It extracts meaning from experiences, discards most of the raw data, and preserves the interpretation. When you later remember the event, your brain reconstructs the experience based on the stored interpretation, filling in missing details with plausible guesses. The result is that every time you remember something, you're actually recreating it. And each recreation subtly changes the memory, incorporating new perspectives, current emotions, and recent experiences. Your memories aren't static records of the past. They're living documents that evolve each time you access them. This is why your childhood seems to have a specific emotional tone, why certain periods of your life feel more meaningful than others, and why your recollections of important events often change over time. You're not remembering what happened, you're remembering your most recent reconstruction of what happened, layered with all the modifications that have accumulated through years of mental replay. But the fiction goes deeper than individual memories. Your entire sense of personal history, the story of who you are and how you became that way, is a carefully curated narrative assembled from selective recollections, each one edited for consistency with your current self-image. The person you remember being is a character you've created, and that character often bears little resemblance to the person you actually were. Consider how your memory of your own personality has changed over time. You probably remember being more consistent, more rational, more principled than you actually were. You remember your motivations as clearer, your decisions as more deliberate, your emotional responses as more justified than they likely were in the moment. This isn't because you're dishonest, it's because your memory system automatically edits your past to make it more coherent and more flattering. The brain abhors contradiction and inconsistency. When your current self conflicts with your remembered self, memory adjusts to resolve the tension. If you see yourself as a kind person, you'll remember acts of kindness more vividly than acts of cruelty. If you see yourself as intelligent, you'll remember your successes more clearly than your failures. If you see yourself as having grown and changed, you'll remember your past self as less mature, less wise, less complete than you probably were. This editing process operates automatically and invisibly. You don't consciously decide to distort your memories. The distortion happens as a natural byproduct of the reconstruction process. Each time you remember something, your current beliefs, values, and self-image influence how the memory is rebuilt. Over time, these influences accumulate, gradually transforming your recollection of who you were into a more simplified, more consistent, more acceptable version of your actual history. The result is that your autobiographical memory is more autobiography than memory. It's a story you've written about yourself based on real events, but shaped by narrative convenience, emotional needs, and psychological defenses. The protagonist of this story, your remembered self, is a fictional character inspired by a real person, but modified for dramatic effect. This explains why people often have radically different memories of shared experiences. It's not that one person is lying or misremembering, it's that each person has reconstructed the event according to their own psychological needs and narrative frameworks. The same objective event becomes multiple subjective stories, each one feeling completely authentic to the person who remembers it. But the fiction extends beyond personal memories to factual memories as well. You remember learning that the capital of France is Paris, but do you remember when or how you learned it? You remember that World War II ended in 1945, but do you remember the source of that information? Most of your factual knowledge feels like direct knowing rather than learned information, as if the facts were always part of your mental landscape rather than acquired through specific experiences. This is because your brain gradually converts learned information into direct knowledge, erasing the traces of the learning process. Facts that you originally acquired through reading, conversation, or formal education become integrated into your sense of what you've always known. The boundaries between what you figured out yourself and what you learned from others dissolve, creating the illusion that your knowledge is more original and more comprehensive than it actually is. This process explains why people often can't remember where they heard certain ideas or why they believe certain things. The provenance of information gets lost as the information becomes integrated into the person's general knowledge base. What started as tentative, source-dependent beliefs become confident, apparently self-evident truths. The loss of source information also explains why people can be so confident in beliefs that are actually based on very limited or unreliable information. When you can't remember where you learned something, it's easy to assume you figured it out yourself through careful analysis. When you can't remember the evidence for a belief, it's natural to assume the evidence must have been compelling. This is how false memories can feel more real than actual memories. A false memory that's been reinforced through repetition and emotional investment can become more vivid and more confident than a true memory that's been neglected or contradicted. Your brain doesn't distinguish between accurate and inaccurate information when deciding which memories to preserve and elaborate. It only considers how often the information is accessed and how emotionally significant it feels. The implications are profound and disturbing. If your memories are reconstructions rather than recordings, if your personal history is a story rather than a documentary, if your knowledge is a blend of fact and fiction with the sources erased, then what do you actually know about yourself or the world? This is the third glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that memory is not a preservation system but a creation system. You don't remember your past, you invent it fresh each time based on fragments of actual experience and guided by current psychological needs. Right now, you're looking at these words and you believe you're seeing them directly, but you're not. You're seeing a highly edited, heavily processed, partially fabricated reconstruction of reality that your brain has assembled from incomplete sensory data. What you experience as direct perception is actually the end product of an incredibly sophisticated manufacturing process that creates the illusion of unmediated access to the world. Your eyes don't capture complete images of your environment. They dart around rapidly, focusing on small areas in sequence, building up a picture fragment by fragment. But you don't experience this fragmented sequential scanning process. Your brain integrates the fragments into a stable, continuous visual experience that feels like a single, unified perception. The integration process fills in massive gaps in your actual sensory data. You have a blind spot in each eye where the optic nerve connects to the retina, but you're not aware of two dark spots in your visual field. Your brain fills in the blind spots with background pattern, seamlessly extending textures and colors across the gaps. The filling in is so convincing that you can't even locate your blind spots without special techniques. But the fabrication goes far beyond filling in blind spots. Your eyes can only see clearly in a tiny area at the center of your visual field. Everything in your peripheral vision is actually quite blurry and colorless, but you don't experience your surroundings as a small, clear spot surrounded by a vast, fuzzy margin. Your brain creates the impression that your entire visual field is sharp and detailed by constantly moving your eyes and combining current sharp glimpses with stored information about what's probably there. This means that most of what you think you're seeing is actually what you remember seeing, what you expect to see, or what your brain assumes must be there based on pattern recognition. Your visual experience is part perception and part hallucination, with the hallucinated elements so smoothly integrated that you can't tell where perception ends and fabrication begins. The same manufacturing process applies to all your senses. When you listen to someone speak, you don't just hear the acoustic vibrations they produce. Your brain predicts what they're going to say based on context, then uses those predictions to fill in words that are unclear or missing. This is why you can understand speech in noisy environments, follow conversations with heavy accents, and comprehend sentences even when some words are obscured or mispronounced. But it also means that what you think you heard is influenced by what you expected to hear. Your brain automatically corrects perceived errors, fills in missed sounds, and adjusts unclear speech to match the most likely intended meaning. The result is that your auditory experience is a collaboration between the speaker's actual words and your brain's interpretive processes. Your sense of touch operates through similar construction principles. When you feel an object, you're not directly sensing its properties. Your brain is interpreting pressure patterns on your skin and constructing a model of what kind of object would produce those patterns. The model includes assumptions about temperature, texture, weight, and material that go far beyond what your tactile receptors actually detect. This is why touch can be so easily fooled by illusions. Rubber hand experiments can make you feel ownership of a fake limb. Temperature illusions can make the same object feel hot or cold depending on the context. Texture illusions can make smooth surfaces feel rough, or rough surfaces feel smooth. Your sense of touch is not a direct readout of surface properties. It's an inference about what you're probably touching based on limited and ambiguous data. The construction process becomes even more complex when multiple senses are involved. Your brain constantly combines visual, auditory, tactile, and other sensory information to create unified perceptual experiences. But the combination process is not neutral. It's influenced by expectations, context, and prior experience. This is why the same sensory input can produce completely different perceptual experiences depending on the setting. A sound that seems like music in a concert hall might seem like noise in a library. A visual pattern that looks like art in a gallery might look like an accident in a parking lot. A touch that feels pleasant in one context might feel unpleasant in another. Your senses don't just detect what's there, they interpret what's there according to what your brain thinks is most likely to be happening. The interpretation process operates so automatically that you're rarely aware it's happening. You experience the interpreted version of reality as if it were direct, unmediated access to the world. But the interpretation is shaped by unconscious assumptions, cultural conditioning, and personal history in ways that systematically bias your perception towards certain kinds of experiences and away from others. Consider how your perception of other people is constructed. When you look at someone's face, you don't just see the arrangement of features. Your brain immediately begins generating inferences about their emotional state, their personality, their intentions, their relationship to you, and their likely behavior. These inferences feel like direct perceptions, but they're actually complex calculations based on subtle pattern recognition, cultural stereotypes, and personal associations. The result is that you never encounter another person neutrally. Every social interaction is filtered through perceptual construction processes that automatically assign meaning, emotion, and significance to ambiguous social cues. You think you're responding to what people are actually doing, but you're responding to your brain's interpretation of what they're doing, and that interpretation is heavily influenced by factors that have nothing to do with their actual behavior. This explains why people can have such different experiences of the same social situation. Each person's perceptual construction system is tuned by different experiences, expectations, and sensitivities. The same facial expression can be interpreted as friendly by one person and threatening by another. The same tone of voice can sound caring to one listener and condescending to another. The same behavior can seem genuine to one observer and manipulative to another. The most disturbing aspect of perceptual construction is how it shapes your sense of self. Just as you construct your perception of the external world, you construct your perception of your internal world. Your sense of your own emotions, thoughts, and motivations is assembled from fragmentary internal sensations using the same gap-filling, pattern-matching, expectation-driven processes that create your perception of everything else. This means that your self-awareness is just as much a construction as your awareness of anything else. The emotions you think you're feeling, the thoughts you think you're thinking, the intentions you think you're having, they're all interpretations of ambiguous internal data, shaped by your beliefs about what kind of person you are. This is the fourth glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that perception is not detection, but construction. You don't perceive reality. You manufacture a version of reality based on incomplete information and unconscious assumptions. You believe you choose what to pay attention to. You believe your awareness is a flashlight that you can aim wherever you decide to focus. You believe that consciousness is something you control, directing it toward whatever seems most important, most interesting, or most relevant to your current goals. You're wrong. Your attention is not a tool you wield, it's a resource that's constantly being hijacked, manipulated, and redistributed by systems that operate completely outside your conscious control. What you experience as deliberate focus is actually the end result of an ongoing battle between different attention capture mechanisms, most of which you're not even aware exist. Right now, as you read these words, your attention is being pulled in dozens of different directions. Part of your brain is monitoring background sounds for potential threats. Part is tracking your physical comfort and posture. Part is maintaining awareness of your emotional state and social context. Part is anticipating what might happen next in your environment. Part is running simulations of possible futures and reviewing memories of the past. You're not consciously directing any of these attention processes. They're happening automatically, driven by evolutionary programming that treats attention as a scarce resource that must be allocated efficiently to ensure survival. Your conscious mind gets to direct only a tiny fraction of your total attention capacity, and even that fraction is constantly being interrupted by unconscious systems that have decided something else is more important. This explains why you find it so difficult to maintain focus on tasks that require sustained attention. You're not fighting against laziness or lack of discipline, you're fighting against attention capture systems that are designed to override conscious direction whenever they detect something that might be more important than what you've chosen to focus on. Every time your mind wanders during a conversation, every time you get distracted while reading, every time you find yourself thinking about something other than what you intended to think about, you're experiencing the victory of unconscious attention allocation over conscious intention. Your brain has determined that whatever captured your attention is more significant than whatever you were trying to focus on. and it has redirected your awareness accordingly. The redirection happens so smoothly that you often don't notice it until after it's occurred. You might suddenly realize you've been staring out the window for several minutes, with no memory of deciding to stop reading and start daydreaming. You might find yourself in the middle of a train of thought with no recollection of how it started. You might discover that you've been listening to a conversation without processing what's being said. Your attention focused on some internal narrative that arose spontaneously and captured your awareness. These aren't failures of self-control. They're examples of how attention actually works. Your conscious mind proposes attention targets, but unconscious systems dispose of them according to criteria you don't understand and can't directly influence. The result is that your subjective experience of being in control of your attention is largely illusory, but the illusion of attentional control is maintained by a fascinating bit of mental sleight of hand. Your brain doesn't just redirect your attention, it also provides post hoc justifications for the redirection that make it seem like the shift was intentional. When you find your attention has wandered, you automatically generate reasons why the new focus is actually relevant, important, or justified. If you start thinking about lunch in the middle of a work task, you might tell yourself you are considering how to optimize your energy levels for better performance. If you get distracted by social media while studying, you might convince yourself you are taking a necessary mental break. If you find yourself rehearsing old arguments instead of focusing on present conversations, you might rationalize it as learning from past experiences. These rationalizations feel authentic because they're generated by the same narrative construction systems that create your sense of unified selfhood. Your brain automatically creates stories that make random attention shifts seem like purposeful decisions, maintaining the illusion that you're in control even when control has been completely abdicated to unconscious processes. The rationalization system is so effective that you can go through entire days without noticing how little control you actually have over your attention. You experience a continuous stream of consciousness that feels deliberately directed, when in reality it's a chaotic sequence of attention captures and redirections, smoothed over by retrospective storytelling that makes the chaos seem coherent. This hidden struggle for attention control has profound implications for how you understand choice, intention, and free will. If you can't reliably control what you pay attention to, then how can you control what you think about? And if you can't control what you think about, then how can you control what you believe, what you feel, or what you decide to do? The answer is that you have much less control than you assume. Your thoughts, emotions, and decisions are heavily influenced by whatever happens to capture your attention at any given moment. Since attention capture is largely unconscious and automatic, this means that your mental life is being shaped by processes that operate below the threshold of awareness. Consider how your mood can be instantly changed by accidentally focusing on certain thoughts or memories. Consider how your opinion of someone can shift based on which of their characteristics your attention happens to highlight. Consider how your sense of what's important or urgent can be manipulated by whatever environmental cues happen to grab your focus. These aren't random fluctuations, they're systematic influences that shape your experience in predictable ways. By understanding what captures attention and how attention shapes thought, it becomes possible to manipulate someone's mental state without their awareness or consent. This is exactly what advertising, political propaganda, social media algorithms, and persuasion techniques do. They hijack attention in ways that influence thought and behavior while maintaining the target's sense of autonomous choice. You think you're making free decisions based on careful consideration of relevant information. But the information that feels relevant is determined by what captures your attention, and attention capture is heavily influenced by factors you're not consciously aware of. The result is that your choices are being shaped by forces that operate outside your conscious control, while your sense of autonomous decision-making remains intact. This is perhaps the most sophisticated form of control possible. influencing someone's choices while preserving their belief that they're choosing freely. It works because the influence operates at the level of attention allocation rather than explicit persuasion. Instead of telling you what to think, it influences what you think about. Instead of commanding your decisions, it shapes the mental context within which decisions are made. This is the fifth glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that attention is not under your control. You don't direct your awareness is directed by systems that operate outside your conscious influence, while maintaining the illusion that you're in charge. You feel angry. The emotion wells up inside you, hot and immediate, triggered by something someone said or did. It feels pure, authentic, undeniably real. It feels like the most honest response you could have to the situation. But what if that anger isn't coming from where you think it's coming from? What if it's not even your anger at all? Your brain doesn't just experience emotions, it manufactures them. Every feeling you have is the end product of an unconscious assembly line that takes raw sensory data, physiological arousal, environmental context, and stored associations, then combines them into what you experience as a unified emotional response. But the assembly process is far more arbitrary and manipulable than you realize. Consider what happens when you feel fear. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your breathing quickens. These physiological changes feel like the natural result of perceiving danger. But research reveals something much stranger. The physiological arousal often comes first, and your brain then searches for an explanation for why you're aroused. It scans your environment for potential threats, reviews your recent thoughts and experiences, and constructs a fear narrative that makes sense of the arousal you're already feeling. This means that what you're afraid of may have nothing to do with what's actually triggering your fear response. You might be physiologically aroused because of caffeine, lack of sleep, low blood sugar, or subconscious processing of subtle environmental cues, but your brain will attribute the arousal to whatever seems like the most plausible threat in your current situation. The fear feels targeted and specific, but it's actually a general arousal state that your brain has retroactively assigned to a particular cause. The same manufacturing process applies to all emotions. When you feel attracted to someone, is it because of their inherent qualities, or because you happen to encounter them when your brain was primed for attraction by factors you're not aware of? When you feel disgusted by an idea, is it because the idea is genuinely repugnant, or because your brain is experiencing physiological discomfort from an unrelated source and projecting it onto the nearest available target? The emotion manufacturing process becomes even more disturbing when you realize how much it's influenced by completely arbitrary factors. Studies show that people judge others more harshly when they're physically uncomfortable, rate things as more disgusting when they're in a dirty environment, and feel more romantic when they're in a dangerous situation. Your emotional responses aren't just evaluations of present circumstances, they're the products of whatever physiological and environmental influences happen to be active at the moment. This explains why your emotions can seem so unpredictable and inconsistent. The same situation can trigger completely different emotional responses depending on factors that have nothing to do with the situation itself. You might react with patience to your partner's criticism when you're well rested and fed, but with rage when you're tired and hungry. The criticism hasn't changed, but the emotion manufacturing plant is operating under different conditions, producing different output from the same input. But the manipulation goes deeper than environmental factors. Your emotions are also shaped by unconscious priming from recent experiences, thoughts, and exposures. If you've been thinking about conflict, you're more likely to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening. If you've been exposed to images or ideas associated with warmth and comfort, you're more likely to feel positive emotions toward whatever you encounter next. Your emotional responses to present events are contaminated by the residue of past mental activity. This means that your emotions aren't pure responses to present reality. They're mixtures of current input and historical interference. When you feel strongly about something, you're not just reacting to that thing, you're reacting to that thing plus all the unconscious influences that are shaping your emotional manufacturing process at that moment. The most unsettling aspect of emotional manufacturing is how it shapes your beliefs about reality. You don't just have emotions about things, you use your emotions as evidence for what those things are like. If something makes you feel uncomfortable, you assume there's something genuinely problematic about it. If something makes you feel good, you assume it has positive qualities. But if your emotions are manufactured from arbitrary inputs, then using them as evidence for reality is like using a broken thermometer to measure temperature. This emotional reasoning process operates constantly and invisibly. When you meet someone new, your initial emotional reaction, which may be based on factors like their resemblance to someone from your past, your current mood, or subtle environmental influences, becomes the foundation for all your subsequent judgments about their character. When you encounter a new idea, your gut response, which may be influenced by how the idea is presented, what you had for breakfast, or what you were thinking about 5 minutes earlier, shapes your evaluation of the idea's validity. The result is that your understanding of the world is systematically distorted by the quirks and malfunctions of your emotion manufacturing system. You think you're making rational evaluations based on objective assessment, but you're actually being guided by emotional responses that are heavily influenced by factors you're not aware of and wouldn't consider relevant if you were. But the distortion isn't random, it's predictable. Your emotion manufacturing system has consistent biases and patterns that shape your responses in systematic ways. If you understand these patterns, you can manipulate someone's emotional responses by controlling the factors that influence their manufacturing process. This is exactly what marketing, propaganda, and persuasion techniques do. They don't try to convince you through logical argument. They try to put you in emotional states that will make you more likely to respond the way they want. They control lighting, music, timing, context, and presentation to prime your emotion manufacturing system to produce responses that serve their purposes rather than yours. The manipulation is so effective because you experience the manufactured emotions as authentic responses to the content being presented. When an advertisement makes you feel excited about a product, you don't realize that the excitement is coming from carefully orchestrated environmental and psychological factors. You assume it's coming from the inherent appeal of the product. When a political speech makes you feel angry about an issue, you don't recognize that the anger is being manufactured through emotional priming techniques. You assume it's a natural response to the injustice being described. Your emotions feel like internal compass that points toward truth, but they're actually external instruments that can be calibrated by anyone who understands how the manufacturing process works. This means that your deepest feelings about important issues may not be your own. They may be the products of sophisticated emotional engineering designed to make you feel certain ways about certain things. The implications extend beyond external manipulation to self-manipulation. Once you realize that emotions are manufactured rather than discovered, you can begin to engineer your own emotional responses. You can learn to recognize the factors that influence your manufacturing process and adjust them to produce the emotional states you want to experience. But this raises a disturbing question. If you could manufacture your emotions deliberately, then what's the difference between authentic feelings and artificial ones? If emotions are constructed rather than discovered, then is there such a thing as a genuine emotional response, or are all emotions equally artificial? The answer suggests that authenticity isn't about the source of emotions, but about awareness of their constructed nature. An authentic emotional response isn't one that arises spontaneously from pure reaction. It's one that acknowledges the manufactured quality of all emotions while still engaging with them as meaningful experiences. This is the sixth glitch in your consciousness. The recognition that emotions are not discoveries, but inventions. You don't find feelings, you create them through an unconscious manufacturing process that can be influenced, manipulated, and engineered. The person you think you are emotionally is largely the product of factors you're not aware of and systems you don't control. You believe you make decisions, you weigh options, consider consequences, evaluate alternatives, and choose the path that seems best. The experience feels deliberate, rational, autonomous. It feels like the essence of free will, the core of what makes you a responsible agent in the world. But neuroscience has revealed something that undermines this entire experience. Your brain makes decisions before you're consciously aware that you're making them. The sense of deliberate choice is a post hoc narrative created after the decision has already been made by unconscious processes. What you experience as decision-making is actually decision reporting. The most famous demonstration of this phenomenon comes from experiments that monitor brain activity while people make simple choices. Researchers can predict which choice a person will make up to 10 seconds before the person reports being aware of their decision. The neural commitment to a particular choice occurs in unconscious brain regions, and only later does consciousness become aware of what has already been decided. This isn't limited to laboratory conditions or trivial choices. The same pattern appears to apply to complex, important decisions in real-world situations. Your brain begins preparing for action before you consciously realize you've made a choice. The elaborate process of conscious deliberation that feels like decision-making is actually a retrospective explanation of choices that have already been made. Think about a recent important decision you made. Can you remember the exact moment when you shifted from being undecided to being decided? Most people can't, because there was no such moment in conscious experience. The decision crystallized gradually in unconscious processing, and consciousness only became aware of it after it was already complete. This explains why decisions often feel like they make themselves. You struggle with a choice for days or weeks, weighing pros and cons without reaching clarity, then suddenly you just know what you want to do. The knowing feels like insight or intuition, but it's actually the moment when unconscious decision-making processes finally communicate their conclusions to conscious awareness. But if consciousness isn't making decisions, what role does it play in choice? The answer appears to be editorial rather than executive. Consciousness doesn't choose. It evaluates, explains, and sometimes vetoes choices that have been made by unconscious systems. You experience deliberation not as the process that determines your choice, but as the process that constructs a justification for choices that have already been determined. This editorial function is crucial for maintaining your sense of rational agency. Your brain automatically generates reasons for your decisions that make them seem logical, consistent, and well considered, even when they're actually based on unconscious factors like emotional associations, random environmental influences, or arbitrary neural fluctuations. The reason generation process is so sophisticated that it can create compelling explanations for completely irrational decisions. People who make choices based on subliminal priming, unconscious bias, or pure randomness will confidently explain why their decisions were logical and well-reasoned. The explanations feel authentic because they're generated by the same narrative construction systems that create your sense of unified identity. But the explanations are often complete fabrications. Studies show that people regularly confabulate reasons for choices that were actually made for entirely different reasons. When the real factors influencing a decision are unconscious or socially unacceptable, consciousness automatically generates alternative explanations that are more palatable and easier to defend. This means that when you explain your decisions to yourself or others, you're not describing the actual decision-making process. You're creating a story that makes the decision seem reasonable and intentional. The story feels true because it's constructed from genuine beliefs and values, but it may have little connection to the factors that actually determined your choice. The confabulation process becomes even more complex when you realize that the stories you tell about your decisions influence future decisions. Each time you explain a choice, you're not just reporting what happened, you're creating a precedent that will guide future choice generation processes. Your brain uses your own explanations as data about your preferences, values, and decision-making patterns. This creates a feedback loop where fabricated reasons for past decisions become real influences on future decisions. You might make an initial choice for completely unconscious reasons, then generate a rational explanation for that choice, then make subsequent choices that are actually guided by the explanation rather than the original unconscious factors. Over time, this process can completely transform your decision-making patterns. You become the kind of person your explanations describe, not because that's who you were originally, but because your brain has learned to make choices that are consistent with the stories you've told about previous choices. This explains why people often seem to develop coherent preferences and decision-making styles over time, even when their initial choices seemed random or inconsistent. The coherence isn't evidence of underlying rational principles. It's the result of narrative construction processes that gradually create consistency by making future choices conform to explanations of past choices. But the theater of decision-making becomes even more elaborate when social factors are involved. When you have to explain your decisions to other people, the explanation generation process becomes influenced by social expectations, cultural norms, and interpersonal dynamics. You don't just create stories that satisfy your own need for rational consistency, you create stories that will be acceptable to your social environment. This means that your decision-making patterns are shaped not just by your individual psychology, but by the explanatory demands of your social context. Different communities require different kinds of explanations for decisions, and your brain learns to make choices that can be justified according to the standards of whatever community you're operating in. The result is that your decisions are influenced by social expectations in ways that operate completely outside conscious awareness. You don't deliberately choose to conform to social norms. Your unconscious decision-making systems automatically generate choices that can be explained in socially acceptable ways. This social dimension of decision-making reveals that choice is not an individual process, but a collaborative one. Your decisions are shaped by the explanatory frameworks available in your culture, the narrative expectations of your social groups, and the implicit pressure to make choices that can be defended according to shared standards of reasonableness. This is the seventh glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that decision-making is not a rational process, but a narrative process. You don't choose and then explain. You choose unconsciously and then create stories that make your choices seem deliberate and reasonable. The person you think you are as a decision maker is largely a fictional character created by post hoc storytelling processes. Who are you right now? Not who you think you are, not who you usually are, but who you are in this specific moment, reading these specific words, in this specific mental state. The question seems simple, but the answer is far more unstable and contextual than you realize. Your sense of identity feels constant and unified, but it's actually a rapidly shifting collage of different selves that emerge and recede based on immediate circumstances. The person you are when you're angry is genuinely different from the person you are when you're calm. The person you are with your family is authentically distinct from the person you are with strangers. The person you are in the morning operates with different values, priorities, and behavioral patterns than the person you are late at night. These aren't just different facets of a single underlying self. They're different selves that share the same body and memory system but have distinct personalities, preferences, and ways of interpreting reality. Your brain doesn't maintain a single coherent identity. It generates different identities in response to different contexts, and each one feels like the real you when it's active. This multiplicity of selves explains why you can make decisions that seem completely out of character, why you can hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously, and why you can be surprised by your own thoughts and behaviors. The person who made that decision, held that belief, or performed that action may have been a different version of you than the one who's now reflecting on it. Think about how differently you think and feel when you're in different emotional states. When you're depressed, the world seems fundamentally bleak, your past seems full of failures, and your future seems hopeless. When you're euphoric, everything seems possible, your past seems full of achievements, and your future seems unlimited. These aren't just different perspectives on the same reality, they're different realities created by different versions of your identity. Each emotional self has its own memory system that preferentially recalls experiences that are consistent with its current state. Depressed, you remembers times when things went wrong and forgets times when things went right. Confident, you remembers successes and forgets failures. Anxious, you remembers threats and forgets safety. Each self reinforces its own worldview by selectively accessing memories that confirm its perspective. But the identity fluctuation goes beyond emotional states to include social contexts, physical environments, and temporal conditions. Professional you operates with different values and behavioral patterns than social you. Home you has different priorities and ways of thinking than public you. Morning you makes different decisions than evening you. Each contextual self emerges automatically and unconsciously when the appropriate triggers are present. You don't consciously decide to become professional you when you enter your workplace. The transition happens automatically as environmental cues activate the neural networks associated with that identity. The shift feels natural because each self experiences itself as the authentic version of you. This explains why people can seem like completely different people in different contexts, and why context has such a powerful influence on behavior. You're not a single person adapting to different situations. You're different people emerging in response to different triggers. The adaptation isn't conscious strategy, it's automatic identity switching. The switching process is so seamless that you're rarely aware it's happening. Each self experiences itself as continuous with previous versions, maintaining the illusion of stable identity even as the content of that identity shifts dramatically. The continuity is maintained by narrative processes that create bridges between different selves, but the bridges often paper over significant discontinuities in actual experience. Consider how your values seem to shift in different contexts. You might strongly value honesty in some situations but find yourself being deceptive in others. You might prioritize family in some contexts but focus entirely on work in others. You might believe in compassion in certain settings but act callously in different environments. These aren't compromises or exceptions, they're different value systems operating through different selves. Each self has access to the same memory bank, but they interpret those memories differently and weight them according to different priorities. The same past experience can be seen as evidence of growth by one self and evidence of failure by another. The same relationship can feel nurturing to oneself and suffocating to another. The same goal can seem essential to oneself and irrelevant to another. This multiplicity of interpretation means that your understanding of your own history is constantly shifting. Each time a different self becomes active, it reinterprets your past according to its own perspective, creating a slightly different autobiographical narrative. Over time, these reinterpretations accumulate, gradually transforming your sense of who you've been and who you're becoming. But the identity fluctuation isn't just automatic, it's also manipulable. If you understand what triggers different selves, you can learn to activate specific identities by controlling your context, your emotional state, your physical environment, and your social circumstances. You can essentially choose which version of yourself to become in any given situation. This controllability reveals that identity is more like a wardrobe than a fixed characteristic. You have a collection of different selves available, and you can learn to select the one that's most appropriate or most useful for your current circumstances. The selection process can become conscious and strategic rather than automatic and reactive. But this raises profound questions about authenticity and responsibility. If you're multiple selves rather than a single self, then which one is the real you? Are you responsible for the actions of selves that feel genuinely different from your current self? Is growth a matter of developing a better self, or is it a matter of learning to access your better selves more consistently? The multiplicity of selves also explains why change can be so difficult and why people often revert to old patterns even after apparent breakthroughs. Change often involves developing new selves rather than modifying existing ones, but the old selves don't disappear. They remain available to be triggered by familiar contexts. Unless you change the contexts that activate unwanted selves, those selves will continue to emerge and influence your behavior. This is the eighth glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that identity is not a stable characteristic, but a contextual performance. You're not one person. You're a collection of different selves that take turns being you. The person you think you are is actually whoever happens to be active at the moment, and that can change more rapidly and dramatically than you realize. Right now, you believe you're experiencing reality directly. You feel present in your environment, aware of your surroundings, connected to the immediate moment. But what if everything you're experiencing is actually a simulation running in your brain, based on predictions about what reality is probably like, rather than direct contact with what's actually there? Your brain doesn't wait to receive sensory information before constructing your experience. Instead, it constantly generates predictions about what you're likely to encounter, then uses incoming sensory data primarily to correct errors in those predictions. Most of what you experience as direct perception is actually your brain's best guess about what's happening around you. This predictive processing operates so seamlessly that you're never aware of the difference between predicted experience and actual experience. Your brain fills in gaps, extrapolates from partial information, and constructs complete sensory experiences from minimal input. The construction process is so sophisticated that the simulated elements are indistinguishable from genuine perceptions. Consider what happens when you're driving a familiar route. Your brain predicts what you'll see around each corner, what traffic patterns you'll encounter, and what sequence of actions you'll need to perform. Most of the time, these predictions are accurate enough that consciousness doesn't need to process much actual sensory information. You're navigating based on your brain's simulation of the route rather than direct perception of the road. This is why you can arrive at a destination with little memory of the journey. You weren't experiencing the actual drive. You were experiencing your brain's prediction of what the drive would be like. When predictions match reality closely enough, consciousness operates in simulation mode rather than perception mode. The simulation process becomes more obvious when predictions fail. When you encounter something unexpected, there's often a moment of disorientation as your brain updates its model of reality. The unexpected element seems to pop into awareness, revealing that everything else was being filled in automatically by predictive processes. But the simulation goes deeper than sensory prediction. Your brain also creates predictive models of other people's thoughts, emotions, and likely behaviors. When you interact with someone familiar, you're largely responding to your prediction of who they are and what they're likely to do, rather than paying close attention to their actual current state. This is why people often seem to be having conversations with ghosts of past interactions rather than present realities. Each person is responding to their predictive model of the other person, which may be based on outdated information or systematic misunderstandings. The conversation feels real because each person is engaging with a sophisticated simulation, but the simulations may have little connection to the actual people involved. The predictive simulation process also shapes your sense of self. Your brain doesn't just predict external reality, it predicts your own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Much of what you experience as spontaneous thought or authentic feeling is actually your brain's prediction of what you're likely to think or feel in a given situation. This means that your sense of being yourself is partly a simulation of selfhood rather than direct experience of selfhood. Your brain generates expectations about how you'll respond to situations, then experiences those expectations as if they were actual responses The result is that you often react to predicted versions of experiences rather than the experiences themselves. The simulation becomes even more complex when it involves temporal prediction. Your brain doesn't just model present reality, it constantly generates simulations of possible futures and alternative pasts. These temporal simulations feel like imagination or memory, but they're actually sophisticated reality modeling processes that shape your current experience. When you worry about something that might happen, you're experiencing your brain's simulation of a possible future, as if it were already real. The anxiety you feel is a genuine response to a simulated experience. When you regret something that happened in the past, you're responding to your brain's current reconstruction of that event rather than the event itself. These temporal simulations have real effects on your present experience. Future simulations create current emotions that influence present decisions. Past simulations modify current memories that shape present interpretations. You're living in a complex mixture of actual present experience and simulated temporal experience with no clear way to distinguish which is which. The simulation process becomes particularly powerful when it involves social reality. Your brain creates elaborate models of social hierarchies, relationship dynamics, and cultural expectations. These models predict how other people will respond to your actions, what consequences you'll face for different choices, and what kinds of behavior are appropriate in different contexts. But these social simulations are often based on limited or outdated information. They may reflect past social environments rather than current ones, or they may be distorted by personal anxieties and cultural stereotypes. The result is that you often respond to simulated social realities that don't match actual social realities. This explains why social interactions can feel so charged and complicated. Each person is responding not just to what's actually happening, but to their simulation of what might happen, what usually happens, what should happen, and what they're afraid might happen. The interaction becomes a collision of multiple reality simulations rather than a simple exchange between people. The most disturbing aspect of reality simulation is how it can become self-reinforcing. When your brain predicts that something will happen, it often unconsciously acts in ways that make that prediction more likely to come true. Predicted realities become actual realities through the influence of simulation on behavior. If you predict that someone will reject you, you might act in ways that make rejection more likely. If you predict that you'll fail at something, you might unconsciously sabotage your efforts. If you predict that a situation will be unpleasant, you might create conditions that make it unpleasant. Your simulations don't just model reality, they participate in creating it. This means that your experience of reality is always partly a product of your expectations about reality. You don't encounter situations neutrally, you encounter them through the filter of your predictive models, and those models shape both your perception of what happens and your influence on what happens. The implications are staggering. If your experience is largely simulated rather than directly perceived, then what's the relationship between your consciousness and actual reality? Are you experiencing the world as it is, or are you experiencing your brain's best guess about what the world is like? This is the 9th glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that experience is not perception, but simulation. You don't encounter reality directly, you experience a sophisticated, predictive model of reality that your brain constructs in real time. The world you live in is partly actual and partly imagined, with no clear boundary between what's real and what's simulated. Your thoughts feel like they originate from within you, spontaneous expressions of your inner mental life. You experience them as private, authentic, and uniquely yours. But what if most of what you think isn't actually your own thinking? What if your mind is more like a radio that picks up signals from external sources than a generator that creates original content? Consider where your thoughts actually come from. When you have an opinion about a current event, is it really your opinion? Or is it a slightly modified version of something you heard from a news source, a social media post, or a conversation. When you make a judgment about someone, are you thinking your own thoughts, or are you unconsciously echoing cultural stereotypes and social expectations? The vast majority of mental content that flows through your consciousness originates from external sources. Your thoughts are largely recombinations of ideas, phrases, concepts, and perspectives that you've absorbed from your environment. What feels like original thinking is actually sophisticated copy and paste operations performed by unconscious mental processes. This mental recycling operates so smoothly that you rarely notice it happening. Your brain automatically selects relevant pieces from your stored collection of borrowed ideas, combines them in ways that seem novel, and presents the result to consciousness as if it were original thought. The recombination process creates the illusion of creativity and originality, but the raw materials are almost entirely second-hand. Think about how your vocabulary shapes your thinking. You can only think thoughts for which you have words, and most of your words come from sources outside yourself. The concepts you use to understand reality were created by other people, in other times and places, for purposes that may have nothing to do with your current situation. You're thinking other people's thoughts, using other people's concepts, then experiencing the result as your own inner mental life. But the borrowing goes deeper than words and concepts. Your fundamental categories of understanding, your sense of what kinds of things exist, what kinds of relationships are possible, what kinds of experiences are valuable, are inherited from your cultural environment. You think you're making independent judgments about reality, but you're actually applying pre-existing frameworks that were installed in your mind by social conditioning. This explains why people from different cultures can have such radically different experiences of the same objective situation. They're not just interpreting reality differently, they're literally thinking different thoughts because they have access to different collections of borrowed mental content. Their thoughts feel equally authentic and original to them, but they're actually expressing different cultural programming. The cultural programming operates through multiple channels simultaneously. Language provides the basic conceptual framework. Media supplies current content and emotional framing. Social interactions reinforce certain patterns of thinking and discourage others. Educational systems install standardized ways of analyzing and evaluating information. Each channel contributes pieces to the mental echo chamber that generates what you experience as your own thinking. But the echo chamber isn't just passive reception, it's also active amplification. Your brain doesn't just absorb external content, it resonates with certain frequencies more than others. Ideas that match your existing beliefs, emotional states, and social identities get amplified and reinforced. Ideas that conflict with your mental infrastructure get filtered out or distorted to fit existing patterns. This selective amplification creates the illusion that your thoughts are more original and independent than they actually are. You notice and remember ideas that confirm your existing mental patterns while filtering out ideas that would challenge those patterns. The result is that your thinking seems consistent and authentic to you, but it's actually the product of a feedback loop that reinforces borrowed content. The feedback loop becomes even more powerful when it involves social validation. Ideas that get positive responses from other people are more likely to be retained and repeated. Ideas that get negative responses are more likely to be abandoned or modified. Over time, your thinking converges toward whatever patterns receive social approval in your environment. This social shaping of thought operates largely through unconscious mimicry. You automatically adopt the speech patterns, conceptual frameworks, and opinion structures of people you want to be liked by or accepted by. The adoption process feels like natural intellectual development, but it's actually sophisticated social conformity operating at the level of mental content. The mimicry is so subtle that you don't notice it happening. You might find yourself using phrases you've never used before, holding opinions you don't remember forming, or thinking thoughts that seem to arise spontaneously but actually echo recent conversations, or media exposures. Your mind becomes a collection of borrowed mental habits that feel like authentic personal characteristics. But the borrowing isn't always conscious or direct. Your brain also absorbs patterns from your environment without your awareness. If you're regularly exposed to certain kinds of logic, emotional reactions, or problem-solving approaches, your mind will unconsciously incorporate those patterns into its own operations. You'll start thinking in ways that match your environment without realizing that your thinking style has changed. This unconscious pattern absorption explains why people who spend time together often develop similar ways of thinking, even when they're not deliberately trying to influence each other. Mental patterns spread through social groups like contagions, creating shared ways of understanding reality that feel natural and obvious to group members but may seem strange or incorrect to outsiders. The pattern contagion operates not just at the level of opinions, but at the level of thinking processes themselves. If you're regularly exposed to people who think analytically, you'll unconsciously develop more analytical thinking habits. If you're surrounded by people who think emotionally, you'll find yourself thinking more emotionally. If your environment rewards certain kinds of reasoning and ignores others, your mind will gradually reorganize itself to produce the kinds of thinking that succeed in that environment. This means that your mental capabilities are not fixed personal characteristics. They're variable responses to environmental demands. You don't have a stable thinking style. You have a collection of thinking styles that get activated by different contexts and social pressures. The version of your intellect that's currently active is largely determined by what kinds of thinking your current environment requires and rewards. The implications are both liberating and disturbing. On one hand, it means you can develop new ways of thinking by changing your environment and the sources of content you expose yourself to. On the other hand, it means that what you experience as your most personal and private mental life is actually a public construction project involving countless external contributors. This is the 10th glitch in your consciousness, the recognition that thinking is not a private activity but a social process. Your thoughts don't originate from within you, they're borrowed, modified, and recombined from external sources. The mind you think is yours is actually a collaborative creation involving everyone and everything you've ever been exposed to. You make choices every day. You decide what to eat, where to go, what to think, how to respond to situations. The experience of choosing feels undeniably real, fundamentally important, essentially human. It feels like the core of what makes you a responsible agent in the world. But what if free will is the most sophisticated illusion your brain creates? The experience of free will requires the feeling that you could have chosen differently. When you select chocolate over vanilla, the choice feels meaningful because you believe vanilla was a genuine alternative that you actively rejected. When you decide to be patient instead of angry, the decision feels moral because you believe anger was a real option that you consciously chose not to pursue. But neuroscience suggests that this sense of alternative possibilities is largely constructed after the fact. Your brain makes decisions through unconscious processes, then creates the feeling that you deliberated between options and chose freely. The alternatives that seem so real during the experience of choosing may be retroactive fabrications designed to maintain the illusion of agency. Consider what happens when you make a spontaneous decision. You might suddenly decide to call an old friend, change your plans for the evening, or buy something you weren't planning to purchase. These decisions feel free because they seem to arise from nowhere, unconditioned by external pressure or internal compulsion. But spontaneity may actually be evidence against free will rather than evidence for it. Spontaneous decisions reveal that choices can emerge from unconscious processing without any deliberate input from conscious will. If you can make decisions without conscious deliberation, then what role does consciousness actually play in the decision-making process? The answer seems to be that consciousness experiences and rationalizes decisions that have already been made by unconscious systems, But the illusion of free will is so convincing that even when you know it might be an illusion, you continue to experience your choices as freely made. Knowledge about the mechanisms of decision-making doesn't eliminate the subjective experience of choosing. This suggests that the sense of agency is built into the architecture of consciousness itself, not just a byproduct of ignorance about how choice works. The persistence of the free will experience may be evolutionarily necessary. Organisms that experience themselves as agents are more likely to engage in complex planning, take responsibility for their actions, and coordinate effectively with other agents. The sense of choice, even if illusory, may be essential for the kinds of behavior that ensure survival and social cooperation. But this creates a paradox. If free will is an illusion that's necessary for effective functioning, then what does it mean to take responsibility for your actions? How can you be praised or blamed for choices that you didn't actually make in the way you think you made them? One resolution is to recognize that responsibility is a social construction rather than a metaphysical reality. Society assigns responsibility to individuals not because individuals have ultimate control over their actions, but because the assignment of responsibility creates incentives that influence future behavior. Praise and blame work not by rewarding past choices, but by shaping future choice generation processes. From this perspective, the question isn't whether you deserve credit or blame for your actions, but whether assigning credit or blame will lead to better outcomes in the future. The justice system, social norms, and personal relationships all operate on this pragmatic approach to responsibility, regardless of what we believe about the metaphysics of free will. But the illusion of free will creates complications beyond moral responsibility. It shapes how you understand personal growth, self-improvement, and change. If you believe you have free will, you're likely to think that changing your behavior is a matter of making better choices through increased willpower or stronger determination. But if choices are made by unconscious processes, then change might require different strategies entirely. Instead of trying to choose differently, you might need to change the conditions that influence your choice generation systems. Instead of relying on willpower, you might need to modify your environment, social context, and mental habits in ways that make better choices more likely to emerge automatically. The focus shifts from controlling choices to influencing the factors that determine what choices get made. This approach to change aligns with research showing that willpower is unreliable and limited, while environmental and contextual interventions can be highly effective. People who successfully change their behavior usually do so by changing their circumstances rather than just trying to make different decisions in the same circumstances. But recognizing the limitations of free will doesn't eliminate the importance of conscious intention and planning. Even if consciousness doesn't make final decisions, it plays crucial roles in setting goals, evaluating outcomes, and adjusting strategies. Conscious reflection can influence unconscious choice generation systems, even if it doesn't directly control them. The key is understanding that consciousness influences choice indirectly rather than directly. Instead of trying to force specific decisions through willpower, you can use conscious awareness to set up conditions that make desired choices more likely to emerge naturally. You become a gardener of your own decision-making environment rather than a dictator of your own choices. This indirect approach to self-direction requires letting go of the fantasy of complete self-control while maintaining engagement with the process of self-influence. You accept that you can't control your choices directly, but you recognize that you can shape the systems that generate choices. The result is a more sustainable and effective approach to personal development. The free will illusion also affects how you understand other people's behavior. If you believe that people choose their actions freely, you're likely to interpret their behavior as direct expressions of their character, values, and intentions. But if behavior emerges from complex interactions between unconscious processes and environmental factors, then understanding others requires attention to context and circumstances rather than just personal attribution. This shift in perspective can lead to greater compassion and more effective interpersonal strategies. Instead of assuming that problematic behavior reflects bad character or poor choices, you can look for the conditions that might be generating that behavior and consider how those conditions might be changed. The recognition that free will is an illusion doesn't eliminate the experience of choice or the importance of decision-making. It reframes choice as an emergent property of complex systems rather than a fundamental feature of conscious control. You still make decisions, but you understand decision-making as a process you participate in rather than a process you control. This is the 11th glitch in your consciousness. The recognition that free will is not a power you possess, but an experience you have. You don't choose freely, you experience the feeling of choosing freely as part of a sophisticated system that generates behavior through unconscious processes while maintaining the sense of conscious agency. You've been thinking about thinking, you've been aware of being aware. You've been conscious of consciousness itself, and in doing so, you've entered a strange loop that reveals the most fundamental glitch in your mental architecture: the impossibility of consciousness fully understanding itself. Every attempt to examine consciousness changes consciousness. Every moment of self-awareness alters the self that's being observed. Every thought about thinking creates new thoughts that weren't there before. You can't step outside your own awareness to observe it objectively, because the act of observation is itself an expression of the very thing you're trying to understand. This creates an infinite recursion. Consciousness, observing consciousness, creates a new level of consciousness that observes the observation, which creates another level that observes the observation of the observation, and so on. Each level of reflection generates new content that changes the system being reflected upon. The observer and the observed are the same entity, making objective analysis impossible. But the recursion trap is more than just a philosophical puzzle. It reveals something crucial about the nature of consciousness itself. It's not a thing you have, but a process you are. Consciousness doesn't exist as a stable entity that can be examined. It exists as an ongoing activity that creates itself moment by moment through the very process of being conscious. This means that everything you've discovered about the glitches in your consciousness is simultaneously true and incomplete. The recognition of autopilot creates a new form of awareness that changes how autopilot operates. The understanding of déjà vu alters your experience of temporal discontinuity. The knowledge of memory reconstruction influences how memories get reconstructed. Each insight transforms the system it describes. You're trapped in a hall of mirrors where every reflection shows you something different than what was there a moment before. The consciousness that began reading about these glitches is not the same consciousness that's now aware of them. The awareness of being unaware has created a new kind of unawareness. The recognition of illusion has generated new illusions. This is why self-knowledge feels simultaneously urgent and impossible. The more you learn about how your mind works, the more your mind changes in response to that learning. The insights that feel most revelatory are also the most destabilizing because they alter the very foundations of the system that produced them. Consider what's happened to your sense of identity since you started exploring these glitches. Are you the same person who began this journey, or have you become someone different through the process of discovery? The question has no stable answer because identity itself is revealed to be a moving target that changes each time you examine it. You might feel like you're waking up from a dream, gaining clarity about the true nature of your mental experience. But waking up is itself a dream that consciousness creates about its own transformation. The sense of enlightenment is another construction, another story your brain tells to make sense of the discontinuous, fragmented, constantly changing process of being aware. This doesn't invalidate the insights. The glitches in consciousness are real phenomena that shape your experience in profound ways. But the understanding of those glitches becomes part of consciousness itself, creating new glitches, new blind spots, new forms of self-deception. You can't fix consciousness because consciousness is not broken. It's working exactly as it's designed to work, creating the illusion of problems that need solving. The recursion trap explains why spiritual practices, psychological insights, and philosophical revelations often lead to new forms of confusion rather than final clarity. Each level of understanding creates new levels of mystery. Each answer generates new questions. Each moment of awakening reveals new depths of sleep. But perhaps this is the point. Perhaps consciousness is not meant to understand itself completely. Perhaps the glitches are not bugs to be fixed, but features to be appreciated. Perhaps the recursive, self-modifying, eternally mysterious nature of awareness is exactly what makes it capable of experience, creativity, and growth. You exist in the space between knowing and not knowing, between control and chaos, between unity and multiplicity. You are the question that consciousness asks about itself, and you are also the answer that keeps changing before it can be fully articulated. You are the glitch in the system that allows the system to know it's a system. The journey through these consciousness glitches brings you to a final recognition. You are not separate from the glitches, you are the glitches. The bugs in your mental software are not obstacles to overcome. They're the very mechanisms through which consciousness experiences itself. Without them, there would be no experience, no awareness, no sense of being someone who exists. Your autopilot isn't malfunctioning, it's allowing unconscious wisdom to guide you. Your déjà vu isn't a temporal error, it's a glimpse into the constructed nature of time. Your memory reconstructions aren't failures of accuracy, they're creative acts of meaning-making. Your perceptual fabrications aren't sensory mistakes, they're collaborative creations between mind and world. Every glitch reveals consciousness doing what consciousness does, creating experience from nothing, finding patterns in chaos, generating meaning from randomness, maintaining the illusion of selfhood while constantly changing, preserving the sense of agency while operating through unconscious processes. You are a beautiful malfunction in the universe's information processing system. You are a recursive loop that has become aware of its own recursion. You are a glitch that has learned to glitch about glitching. And in this final recognition, something shifts. Not understanding, but acceptance. Not control, but appreciation. Not answers, but a deeper comfort with questions. The glitches in your consciousness are not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be lived. You are conscious, you are glitchy, you are exactly as you should be. The recursion continues, but now you're dancing with it instead of fighting it. The Hall of Mirrors becomes a playground rather than a prison. The infinite regress becomes an infinite adventure. Welcome to the beautiful, broken, perfectly imperfect experience of being aware. Welcome to consciousness. This is the final glitch, the recognition that understanding consciousness fully would eliminate consciousness. The bugs in your mental software are not flaws to be corrected, but the very source of your ability to experience anything at all. If this scrambled your mind, the next layer goes even deeper, but you'll have to choose whether to keep following the recursion or trust that some glitches are meant to remain gloriously, mysteriously broken.